All right, good morning again. So let's go ahead and kick this off. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. So today we have two guest speakers. We have Chris Cubbage from Retirement Advocates, and then we also have Joe Burt from Pension Plan Specialist. So they're going to help walk us through the CARES Act, again, specific to the 401k and how that affects participants, how it affects plan sponsors, and what are some additional steps that you may or may not need to take in the future regarding how you implement the different legislation that's come down from this. So we're going to kick it off with Chris, and we are going to specifically jump into the CARES Act of 2020. So Chris, you want to go?
Terrific. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Cubbage, and I'm the owner and founder of Retirement Advocates here in Portland, Oregon. And we assist Xenium with working at a fiduciary level to make sure that we're taking care of all the fiduciary duties necessary with your sponsorship of a retirement plan through Xenium, as well as being a resource to you, as well as Joe and Xenium are, to providing whatever support we need to provide for you at an individual plan sponsor level. So as I dive right into the CARES Act, the CARES Act's obviously a fairly large body of legislation related to basically providing relief for everyone through this clearly unprecedented event, trying to help people essentially bridge the gap here between getting through this event, hopefully sooner than later to the other side of this, to whatever extent we can, to get back to what normal in our economy will be. I'll speak directly to the specifics of the act relative to 401k. And to put it quite simply, what the CARES Act is creating is the opportunity to provide much more favorable access to your 401k retirement balances. And again, is to provide a bridge to kind of get to the other side of this crisis in the event. It almost goes without saying, and I'm about to say it here, it's less than ideal to tap into your retirement savings for current financial needs in normal times, but as we all clearly understand, this is anything but normal times. So what I'll do is just kind of walk through real briefly what these loosened provisions, if you will call it that, relative to gaining access to your 401k balances for current financial needs look like. So the way the CARES Act reads is there's a question of who's a qualified person to have access to these enhanced availability of 401k. So who would a qualified person under the CARES Act look like? You've got to be able to certify that you have adverse financial consequences, a function of the COVID-19 panic. It's kind of hard the way this is written for me to find anybody that isn't somehow impacted in a way by this pandemic that wouldn't qualify. And I will go a step further and say this is a self-certification process. So at the end of the day, pretty much everyone has access to doing this because you self-certify. Trust me, the government has enough problems right now trying to figure out how to adjudicate all of the things going on right now. Whether you're legitimately available to use your 401k in a more enhanced way is not something they want to have anything to do with. So basically everybody can pretty much use this. If we can move the slide forward, Chanda. So basically, the first part of this is giving people the ability to take withdrawals from the plan. Typically, historically, if you want to take a withdrawal from a 401k plan, you had to qualify for a hardship withdrawal typically. There was a 10% penalty tax that applied to withdrawals in addition to normal taxation. That these withdrawals are one of the areas where there's relief available. The standard 20% withholding of these withdrawals is going to be reduced to 10%. They're going to eliminate that 10% penalty tax. So the only thing you're going to be responsible for would be normal taxation that would apply, no penalties. There's an availability to provide income tax, I would call this smoothing, over 3 years, so that you're not taking the entire hit of that distribution or withdrawal in the first year. You're spreading it out over 3 years, which is obviously beneficial. The maximum amount you'll be able to withdraw under this feature is $100,000. And there is some provision there if you're using it as more of a short-term bridge and you want to replace those funds early on and not have tax consequences. there are some availability to do that essentially as a rollover, putting it back into the plan. And this is all available between now and December 31st. This is not a permanent feature. It's just something that's meant to be temporary in the interim through December 31st. Depending on how this all develops, I wouldn't be surprised if some of these dates that I'm going to talk about today change or extended. Frankly, I hope that that's not necessary because we get back to some sense of normality and this is less necessary, but I'll keep my fingers crossed for everybody on that. If we could flip to the next slide. The other option is accessing funds through a loan provision of the plan. Historically, the IRS limitation for loans in a qualified retirement plan where you could take up to 50% of your account balance not to exceed $50,000. That's been changed to being able to take 100% of your account balance. I'll say this, it was always your vested account balance, but they're moving that limit from 50,000 to 100,000. So, obviously that's quite a bit more attractive than taking that out. That's available for 180 days beginning March 27th, which is when this legislation was signed. In addition, to provide additional relief for participants, loan payments can now essentially be deferred. They can be delayed for up to a year. And then, there's a whole protocol for reestablishing a reamortization schedule and a repayment schedule that's favorable for starting that up when those payments need to be made again. I'll be really clear on this. There's a clear recognition that delaying that for a year and then having to double up on payments is not going to work. So basically it'll be reamortized over a period of time. So it's still similar, if not the same payment. You've just basically tacked it onto the other end of your payment to make good on all of that distribution. We can flip to the next page, Shanda. So just as a quick summary, you can take withdrawals up to $100,000, vastly enhanced loan limitations and loan capability. I will say on some of this loan information, we'll be glad, Joe, Bert, and I, and everyone at Xenium's glad to talk with you all individually about circumstances you have or questions you may have that apply more to your individual situation. The whole idea here was just to kind of turn your radar onto the idea that, hey, these things are now available. We're glad to help you walk through, hey, what do these things look like in terms of utilizing them for the purpose they were designed for, and we're glad to assist with that. The only other thing I would mention here that related to retirement plans, it actually does suspend the requirement to do required minimum distributions at age 70 and a half. Basically, that's just been suspended. I think the idea there is forcing people to take distributions from a plan when their accounts may be significantly down due to market volatility. That's another form of relief that's been provided by the Act. So with that, maybe we'll flip to the next slide. I'll turn it over here. We can flip to the next slide. I'll turn this over to Joe Burt with Pension Plan Specialist. He's going to talk a little bit about more some of the other issues that plan sponsors are questioning and are curious about relative to matching contributions and plan terminations and all the other things that are sort of pertinent to all of us at this point as we think about how to get to the other side of this this crisis. So with that, Joe, you want to?
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you and glad I could share some information that might be useful to you as we all try to navigate our way through this interesting time. So let me start with one of the more popular questions that we receive is, am I able to stop, if I'm a safe harbor plan, and am I able to suspend my safe harbor contributions? As many of you may know, a safe harbor contribution is what allows you to not be beholden to the compliance tests that are applicable to your plan. And most often, people are confused by the fact that you make this contribution. It's a mandatory contribution that you must give your employees 30-day notice prior to the beginning of the year that you're going to make this contribution. And so getting out of the contribution during a normal situation is somewhat difficult. But in today's environment, it is possible to suspend your safe harbor contributions. It does come with some caveats, however, and that is that in order to cease those contributions, you must first give your employees 30-day notification that you're going to stop making those contributions. You have to also make sure that you're making those contributions up and through the period of when the amendment states that you'll be ceasing those contributions. So you'll have to amend your plan that says, hey, we've suffered some sort of a financial hardship, or obviously we're going through this economic crisis, and we're going to stop making these contributions. So we want to amend our plan to stop, and then we'll have your plan will be then amended, and you'll give your employees a 30-day notice that says, hey, we're not going to be able to make these contributions, and that will then subject you back into the testing environment. And the question I often get is, now that we've been a safe harbor for the first few months of the year, does that mean that we're only going to be tested for the remainder of the year under the ADP or the average deferral percentage test? And the answer is, once you stop the safe harbor contributions and amend your plan, you will be subject to testing for the remainder of the year, including the portion in which you were a safe harbor. So for the entire plan year, you'll be subject to the testing, the compliance testing that comes along with that. But the good news is that you can stop that contribution once you've provided your employees with a 30-day notice that you plan to do so. Another quick question I always get is, well, can we start the safe harbor back up again later in the year? And unfortunately, the answer is you can't. Once you've stopped the safe harbor for the year, the safe harbor is over until the following year. Shanda, do you mind? There we go. Thank you so much. Another question we oftentimes get is, what is the difference between being laid off and having furloughs? And there's a substantial, there's some importance there, obviously, between the two, but there's a lot of confusion right now in terms of what is a layoff and what is a furlough. So furloughed employees are temporarily laid off. So the employer has some sort of a reasonable expectation that they're going to bring those employees back to their full-time position, or even perhaps a part-time position sometime soon in the near future. In general, the people who are furloughed, they're typically not being paid during these furloughs, but they do get to keep all of their employee benefits that they have received. And that would include things like health insurance and retirement as well. The other component of it that's really important to understand is that because this is really more of a temporary thing, it's oftentimes confused by the ability for somebody to go and get unemployment benefits or not get unemployment benefits. And we'll get into more of the termination side here in just a few minutes. But this is something that where an employer can say, hey, we're going to bring you back, but we're just not sure when. So it's an indefinite type of a situation, whereas with layoff, it is more of a permanent, we don't plan to bring you back. So kind of getting back into let's jump into layoff for just a second. When an employer dismisses employees because they can no longer afford to pay them, they just don't have the business to do it, or maybe the economic reasons, they just don't have the funds to keep employees on payroll at this point. And so they have to let them go. And by letting them go, they have a legal separation of service. And that's what's really a big difference between the furloughed employees and the laid off employees. Those that have that separation of service, it is a permanent thing that allows the employees to go to seek out unemployment. But it also creates this separation of service where the employee is then entitled to rules of distribution, where there's other things that they can take from the retirement plan, move their plan assets out of the plan, roll it over to another, perhaps another plan or into an IRA, or maybe even take some cash distribution. So there's some real differences between the two. Furloughed employees that just assume that they are going to come back at some point in time, might be an indefinite period, but they are going to come back. And laid off employees, they're more of a permanent situation with less certainty as to whether they'd be rehired. So when it comes to termination, and this would be more of a termination of a plan versus termination of employees, but there is a factor of when we let employees go that plays a part into a partial plan termination. So I'd like to just cover that for just a minute. Obviously, we're a few months into 2020, and we have already unfortunately seen some companies that have had to close their doors. And so we've also had companies that have come and said, hey, I need to terminate my plan. I just can't afford to have a plan anymore. And what we'd like to say to them is, instead of terminating the plan at this point, with all of the uncertainty that's going on, maybe consider freezing the plan. You can always amend a plan to be frozen, and you can always unfreeze the plan at any point in time. What's nice about it is that it doesn't have the same effect as a full plan termination. in the sense that when you terminate a plan, every employee becomes 100% vested. So if you have a vesting schedule and you terminate all your employees, everyone would be 100% vested. The other downside to terminating your plan is that you have to wait a full 12 months before you can start a new plan up again. So it might be really a good idea to consider freezing the plan as opposed to just terminating it. Now, when we have a lot of employees that we've laid off, we've been in kind of what we call a partial plan termination. Now, partial plan termination, typically it occurs when we have an involuntary separation of service between your normal employees and those employees that you have now terminated. And it's different than the termination that occurs in the course of your natural business. So if, for example, every year you have 35 people who turn over and you have 100 total employees, well, that's 35% of your employee base. And you replace those 35 people. So throughout the course of the year, you're going to replace those positions. That is not considered a partial plan termination. A partial plan termination is when you have at 20% or greater of your employee workforce has turned over and is not replaced. And once you've done that, you trigger what's called a partial plan termination, which means that all of those employees are 100% vested. So any account balance that they might have and anything that they were not previously vested in, they would then be subject to 100% vesting. I bring this up because oftentimes it's a frustration to employers when they didn't know that by making these changes and by letting some folks go, they are then subject to that vesting schedule where they were maybe anticipating some of those forfeiture assets to come back that would maybe offset future contributions to the plan. So it's important to note that there's a difference between a plan termination and a partial plan termination. Partial plan termination, again, means only a 20% or greater of the plan is terminated, and that group would be 100% vested. Shanda? So do I have to amend my plan to adopt all of these provisions? Right now, it's an interesting situation because all of the investment companies are out there making lots of changes. In fact, Principal made a declaration this week that they were going to opt everybody into this. Everybody was going to have the ability to opt into these provisions. And in the end, you can choose to not be a part of these provisions. But what will happen is your plan document will at some point need to be amended. In fact, the deadline to amend is before January 1st, 2022. And Xenium will be working with the team to make sure that the plan is in compliance and that everything is amended. But on an individual basis right now, there is no action to take. Just keep in mind that there might be some notices and some other things that will be distributed to the participants at a later date. Shanda?
Sorry about that. Yes, I am here. Thank you so much, Joe. We really sorry about that. So now we're going to move back to Chris, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the big picture of what's going on in our world these days. One thing I did want to mention that I forgot to at the very beginning is that we are recording the webinar, so you will get a copy of the recording along with the PowerPoint presentation. And there is a Q&A option as well. So if you want to throw your questions into the Q&A, then at the end, we'll go through and we'll talk about the ones that are 401k specific. I know that we've got quite a few in here that I think Chris and Joe can both help us answer. So we'll do that at the very end. So I apologize, I didn't say that to begin with. All right, Chris?
Yeah, terrific. We kind of flip to the next slide. I'm kind of just going to speak a little bit. I'm sure everybody out there is kind of, questioning, so what does this all mean for my 401k account? Obviously for yourselves personally, I'm sure, but also for the participants in your plan. So just, I want to, do a quick 5 to 10 minute sort of quick thought on what we're seeing happening and what we think that sort of means and provide a little context for help there, with the recognition that an unprecedented event is very hard to predict the outcome ultimately is going to occur. But I think there's some things going on that can give us some guidance, some reason for optimism, and also some context for really just staying the course and seeing the opportunity in this relative to what's going on. If we think about this, when everything really started with this, global pandemic to the point where Americans really realized it was real, obviously we saw a very significant downturn in the equity markets, a lot of disruption in credit markets as well. Contrary to the '08 crisis event, which is kind of the obvious thing we would compare this to, the Federal Reserve did a pretty good job of coming in and really settling, as I call it, the plumbing of the credit markets and some other things that created some stability. Obviously, we saw a very sharp downturn in the stock market. I think we were down probably somewhere in the range of 35% if you looked at the S&P 500, maybe as close as 40% on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And then what we've recently seen is a very significant snapback to where, when you think about the economic abyss that we're sort of staring into at the moment, I apologize if that's a little bit of a dire way to describe that, but I think it's unprecedented the way we've essentially got significant economic shutdown here that we've really never seen anything like before. We're sitting today at probably about a 13 to 15% roughly downturn on equity markets, and bond markets are relatively flat or stable. I think a lot of that has to do with what I'm showing on the screen here, which is if you look back till about 2018, there's a really heavy correlation between global central bank liquidity and the forward progression of the S&P 500, which I'm using as sort of a proxy of, quote, the market. It's no coincidence that when this all went down and we were sitting at that 35 to 40% downturn in markets and staring into the abyss, so to speak, the Federal Reserve basically kind of came out and said, and global central bankers all over the world, China, Japan, the Eurozone, basically came out and just flooded the market with liquidity with what I would describe as a tsunami of money. That really created some stability, created some of that snapback, I believe. And for lack of a better term, kind of create somewhat of hopefully a backdrop for this market so that there's some stability there, and that they've got to create hopefully some floor, if you will, under the stock market in particular, to create some stability. Additionally, they've basically been very clear. The Federal Reserve in our country, Jerome Powell, who's the chair of the Federal Reserve, basically came out, he was very direct and said, I will do whatever it takes to backstop this economy, to backstop this market. It was not a vague declaration. So with that, I still think what we're looking at here is we're still in an unprecedented event. I still think no matter what we say, the downturn in the economy and the second quarter, I think, corporate earnings and various things that we look at as fundamental measures of where the market should be are going to be very ugly. It's going to, no matter what you're prepared to see, it's still sort of alarming when it comes out. The hope there is that's a temporary thing that we will come to the other side of. You've got the hope that global central bank liquidity that I'm describing here, the tsunami of money, I'd call it a wave, but this is bigger than that. and it will continue, not just on the fiscal side with the CARES Act and everything else that we're seeing, but this global bank liquidity will hopefully be what I call the catalyst for a somewhat healthy recovery on the other side of this pandemic. I will also say, too, while it's painful to see the kind of volatility and downturn that we've seen recently, it is a buying opportunity. It's a much better place to buy stocks when they're down than where they're up in terms of a long-term buying perspective. So for those people that are fortunate enough to have continue to be employed and can continue to make contributions to their retirement plan, and their employers are in a position to continue making contributions, this volatility that I believe we'll continue to see. I think you're going to see markets move up and down quite a bit from here. We're going to, the information is going to push and pull and tug and pull on the markets going up and down. So volatility is going to be the air we breathe for a while, I believe. But ultimately, that's a buying opportunity for a lot of people that are still in a position to make contributions to their retirement accounts. So that's kind of the big picture and all of that, in the sense that I guess I would say that we're in a very challenging time. I think volatility and uncertainty will continue. I'm fundamentally optimistic long term. And there's an old saying, probably some of you've heard it before. It's kind of an industry term for us. And basically the term is, don't fight the Fed. So our Fed is the Federal Reserve, our central banker. When our central banker says we're going to throw a lot of money at that, don't bet against that, because that sort of liquidity and that much money chasing returns is going to create some momentum forward from this event, and that's the overall entire intent. So that's kind of the big picture with that. You know, it's going to be a little or maybe a lot ugly here in the coming months, but the long-term perspective is positive, and this is a great opportunity for a lot of people to be putting money to work during these volatile periods. So with that, I will turn it back to Shanda for opening it up for Q&A at this point.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. We appreciate that. So we've had a few questions that have come in today, specifically, again, around the CARES Act and how it relates to the 401k. So one of the questions that came in, Chris or Joe, is does this also apply to a simple IRA plan or a 403b?
I'll let you take that one, Joe.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry, I try to get my mute button off there. Yeah. So the answer is yes to 403b for sure. And simple IRAs, although I don't work much with simple IRAs, I believe that they do also qualify. Under the rules, they are mentioned a couple of times in different components, but I believe the question was specific to the matching contribution and whether or not that could be lowered. I don't know the exact answer to that, but I will find that out, Shanda, and I will let you know.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that was an additional question of if the company has a simple IRA and they normally do that 3% match, can they lower that? So we'll follow back up on the specific, excuse me, of that one. The next question that came in was, what if your plan does not allow for loans? Can the plan be amended now to allow for them?
It sure can. Yes, you can allow for loans or distributions at any point. That is a discretionary amendment, so you could do that.
Excellent. And then is there any specific impact that you two would see for small businesses in particular with regards to some of this legislation?
So impact in yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
No, go ahead. No, please. That's a great question, but it's we got 2 hours to talk through that. Feel free, Joe. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the real impact is going to be what we call leakage. So the Feds for years have tried to prevent retirement plan leakage, meaning money moving out of the plan that was cashed out by a participant. Maybe not necessarily a need, but more of a want by a participant. And so I think one of the considerations here is, do employees really need to be able to access the full $100,000? And if so, is that really in the plan's best interest? And more importantly, is that really in the participant's best interest, just to take the money because they can or they want to versus a real need? There isn't necessarily any legal impact either way, whether you allow it or you don't allow it, or allow for these provisions or don't allow for these provisions. So there's nothing there that you need to be concerned about. It's really more of just the long-term ability for the participant to be prepared for retirement. And if they take out these monies now, they may not have what they need at a later time.
I think I would only add to this, and I'm not sure this is really totally retirement related, but what I see happening here is there's clearly an advantage for people in this CARES Act relative to other areas of relief that have to do with our small businesses getting the same level of advocacy in terms of the PPP program and small business loans and things like that, relative to larger organizations that, let's face it, they're just higher on the radar to the bankers and the other people sort of distributing this money. So I would say that the value of small businesses having strong advocacy or finding people that can support them and help them take advantage of some of the other aspects of this legislation are very meaningful. So, I spent a lot of time lately talking to different people about sort of how to do that. So if anybody's, I'm sure Joe's got a lot of connections when it comes to those things as well. So if there's any sort of assistance we can provide with helping you get connected with people that can advocate for you on that behalf. I'm anxious to do that. And candidly, this is a little bit of a personal statement. I'm a little disappointed that I think small businesses are not getting nearly the level of attention here that I think the larger organizations are getting. So, but I'm optimistic that that's being addressed. But it better happen quick, because this is, a complete shutdown of the economy of the nature we're talking about here doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room for relief. So, other questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So another question that came in then was, do we know if 457 plans are subject to the same changes?
So 457 plan, if it is a 457B as in Bravo. So the question, whomever might have asked that question would probably know that whether they have a 457B plan or a 457F plan, and perhaps you maybe have both of them. If you have a 457B plan, that does apply under the CARES Act, but the 457F plan does not.
Perfect, thank you. So another question that came in was that they had heard an interpretation of the new 401k rules that said only the participant counted for financial hardship. In this particular instance, they have continued to pay all of their employees, so the business itself is not having a financial hardship.
So just to make sure I understand the question, they're saying that the participants had a financial hardship, but the company has not had a financial hardship, so they cannot perhaps suspend the safe harbor, or maybe that's what they're alluding to? I'm not sure. I'll have to.
That's how I would read it, yes. Because really there's aspects of that, right? So like the CARES Act is specifically talking towards the employee personally having sort of hardship. They can't pay their rent, they can't eat, they can't get food, unemployment's late, which is separate and from an employer that then for other business reasons could not make or did not have the means to continue to make the safe harbor contribution, for instance.
Yeah, so back in 2009, when the feds, we were kind of having a tough time back then as well, obviously much different than we are now, but the feds made a decision that they were going to allow for suspension of safe harbor at that point. Up until then, you couldn't suspend a safe harbor plan unless you had real significant reason or terminated the plan. In this particular case, and back in that time, it was, just as Chris said about the participants, it was sort of a self-certification process. It still remains that way. And so it's a very loose definition. It's financial hardship. So if a company can prove that they have a financial hardship, then they could suspend safe harbor. And that definition is very broad. The feds have never said to us, well, this is what constitutes a financial hardship. If the company feels like they might enter into a financial hardship, or they're in a financial hardship, or things are so uncertain that they're worried about making, using funds that have otherwise been set aside for retirement, but maybe need those to pay for overhead costs just to stay in business. Those are the types of things that the feds would look at and say under investigation, under an audit, would say, well, yeah, that does justify the suspension of the safe harbor. And I think that sort of what Chris said earlier, the feds have a lot on their plate, and if an employer decides that they're going to suspend their safe harbor contribution because they are uncertain or because of this financial hardship that they deem to be so, and again, it's just as long as they can validate why they made that decision, then they will be fine.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, let's see here. Hang on one second, please.
Oh, I do see that one of the callers did mention it was a B plan, so that's great.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I saw that too. So yes, it would be subject then to the CARES Act. All right. I think that, so sorry, just kind of related around the hardship, the additional question is does the spouse's situation matter? And again, you're self-certifying, if you are the participant, you're certifying that you have a hardship, and that is for your household. So I would say that again, it's not going to matter if you personally, if it's your spouse, if it's whatever your family situation is that's going on, then again, that personal hardship self-certification would take into consideration your entire familiar, everybody that's in your family.
Yeah.
Would you guys agree?
Shanda, this is interesting because it's one of the very few times the feds have ever allowed us to be this broad in the definition. The only other time this happens, and we don't experience that necessarily where we live, but this happened during Hurricane Katrina and similar situations for folks that lived in that area. Hey, if you have a hardship of any type, and there was never a situation where the feds went back and questioned anyone's decision under self-certification. So I think most people can rest assured that if you feel like you qualify, you're probably going to be just fine.
It's hard to visualize anybody that hasn't been touched or impacted in some way by this this crisis.
Absolutely. Agreed. So the additional question, one more that had come in, does the hardship apply not only to the 401k, but for any type of IRA account?
So yes, so if you have an IRA, the IRAs, they do apply for purposes of loan, distribution, and RMD.
And then that would be, Joe, so would that be for if I as an individual have an IRA account, right? If I was to start taking distribution,
Right.
then I would have the tax penalty. So whether it's a personal IRA or a simple or a group IRA?
That's right. That's correct.
Okay.
So I'm racing through the regs, trying to find anything that talks about suspension of the simple 401k, simple IRA contribution. I have yet to find it, but we'll keep looking.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much for everyone that attended. Thank you, Chris and Joe, for your expertise. It's a lot of really great information. As I mentioned, all the participants, you'll get all of our contact information as you can see on the slide here. Please feel free, to reach out to any of us if you do have questions about amending your plan, stopping the safe harbor. If your participants have questions, where's the best place to direct them so that they can get a hold of this information? Well, certainly, we're happy to help kind of point you in the right direction. So again, thank you very much. Thanks, Chris and Joe, and we will now end the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.